Hi, this is Gene from Listening and Radio, KB9001 SSB, MWDX, SWL, and of course WN9ZWC. And I wanted to get on here and do a short podcast about space weather, and particularly sun cycles and how that works and how that affects radio. But that term space weather is something that is so important to the technology community that even if you go to ready.gov, which is the emergency services website or overarching emergency website where people go to look up certain situations and contingency plans for certain emergencies, and they actually have a contingency plan at ready.gov for space weather. It's ready.gov/space weather. And it's kind of interesting. So what is space weather? This is the terminology according to ready.gov. The term space weather refers to the variable conditions on the sun and in space that can influence the performance of technology that we use on Earth. Space weather can produce electromagnetic fields that induce extreme currents in wires, disrupting power lines, or even causing widespread outages. Severe space weather can also produce solar and magnetic particles, which can damage satellites used for commercial communications, global positioning, intelligence gathering, and weather forecasting. And this is all true. And for a lot of people might not understand this, or maybe they've heard the term space weather, or they've heard like back in the 90s, I used to listen to Art Bell, and I'm sure a lot of when I mentioned the name Art Bell, a lot of ham radio operators knew who he was, and they'll understand. They do understand the type of content that Art put out, and some of the theories that he put out by some of the guests he had on. And one particular guest that comes to mind that Art used to have on his program quite often was a guy by the name of Major Ed Dames, and he had talked a lot about space weather and a future event where a solar flare would wipe out all the communications on Earth or do actual damage on the surface of the Earth, like physical damage to the surface of the Earth. And Ed Dames, you might call that kind of like a conspiracy theory, or it sounds like a conspiracy theory. But the reality of the matter is, it is partially true. If I was Snopes.com, and I'm not, and I don't always believe Snopes.com either, but if I was thinking along their lines, I would have to say that the story that Ed Dame put out was 3/4 true, because space weather is a real thing. I've seen it at nighttime. I worked an outside job in public safety, and I was outside at all different hours, including working night shifts all night long in the middle of nowhere. And I watched space weather happen at nighttime that you would not see happen during the day. I recall a particular incident during the 1990s when there was solar flares that were hitting the Earth, and when the sun went down at about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, I was actually calling up my wife, and I was waking her up in the middle of the night. She thought I was crazy. And I'm like, you got to walk outside and go look in the sky and see what I'm seeing. What appeared to be what at the time we thought, or I thought, was the Northern Lights. And by the way, the Northern Lights is the same sort of situation that I seen in the 1990s, but it's not usually seen as far south as we are, but this was a lot different. And by the way, the Aurora Borealis is space weather, just like any solar flare could present or manifest something you would see in the atmosphere during a solar flare. But what I saw in the middle of the night during the early 1990s was these flares that were covering the entire dome of the Earth, and you could see it rushing across the dome and kind of crashing into it and spreading out over the atmosphere. And you could see that you could actually, like it was like you were looking up at a planetarium and watching a show at a planetarium, because you could see the curve of the atmosphere above you and the atmosphere protecting the Earth from these severe solar flares, and they would see streaks of white, red, blue screaming across the sky. It was actually quite frightening, to tell you the truth. It was very disconcerting. But I'm talking about this to make people understand how it applies to ham radio and citizens band and radio, the radio hobby in general. Can space weather have a severe effect on radio communications? Yes, and particularly in the HF bands, it wreaks havoc in the HF bands. Even when things are somewhat normal, We just came out of a sun cycle, or I should say we came into a new sun cycle. We came out of a period where the sun cycle was down, and now 11 meters is open. 11 meter sideband is wide open all over the world. 10 meters is wide open for the ham radio community. During this last week, we've heard stations from all over the world. So it's interesting to note that space weather does affect everything that we do in radio. It has a huge effect. Okay, so with that said, this is again from ready.gov, and I wanted to cover some of these because it's kind of neat because they're actually very worried about space weather, and they actually make some recommendations which I found kind of really interesting. It says before space weather occurs. So this tells you that it's a real fear. They're giving you tips here. Space weather related power outages can cause loss of water and wastewater distribution systems, loss of perishable foods and medications, loss of heating and air conditioning and electrical lighting systems, loss of computer systems, telephone systems, communication systems, including disruptions in airline flights, satellite networks, and GPS services, loss of public transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we talk about, I was talking about Major Ed Dames and some of the things he would say on the Art Bell Show, and it goes to show you that, most of what Ed Dames said was correct. And now, we're looking at how the government looks at it. And I guess they fill in that other third or 25% or whatever it is of information and say, yeah, we are worried about it. Could it knock out communications? Could it knock out satellites? Could it disrupt communications and production? Well, I guess, they could. But they recommend making an emergency kit. And I found this pretty interesting. And I would recommend that anyhow. By the way, if you're a ham radio operator or you're an emergency communications guy, you're going to be one of the most important guys or girls or ladies in a situation where when an emergency comes in, if cell phone towers go down and all that great stuff, you're going to be the one with the radio communications. Just like if you watched MASH back in the day, you used to see Radar O'Reilly sitting in Korea on his radio connecting family members through ham radio operators in the United States, and then they would do phone patches to patch people through. Well, we're going to end up being those people in this sort of emergency. Then again, I'm sure the government has their share of HF equipment, and they're probably going to do the same thing. But locally, I think if things really went down, would they lean on ham radio operators? Yes, they did during Katrina. They did during 9/11. So it's very practical for them to approach areas and races and all that stuff and have them set up communications. This is why we do winter field day and field day during the summer to practice those emergency communications. So I just wanted to mention that, and I suggest maybe you take a look at ready.gov, or if you go to qrz.com and you look on their front page on qrz.com, their landing page, on the page itself there is a sun weather app on there, and you can always see which frequencies are open, so it's very handy to look at. In fact, if you click into that, it'll take you to the direct website that covers that space weather, and it'll give you a lot more information there too. So, okay, I won't take up any more of your time. I just wanted to touch on that real quick and give everybody an idea, where to go to look for space weather information. Maybe take a look at ready.gov space weather. Might be interesting to look at. Put a Go kit together. I have a Go kit with communications gear in it myself and portable gear, and I actually have a portable power source that I built for taking with me. It has a 12-volt power supply, and I can charge phones. I can run a radio. I can do a bunch of stuff. It's solar powered, and I'll do a show on that next time around. I think that would be a good thing to look at. Okay, this is Gene. I took up enough of your time. Have a great day. Enjoy the podcast.